Many thanks to all present. Thank you, Professor Espert, and, as José Luis pointed out, we, at the time of taking office, were on the verge of what was designed to be the worst crisis in Argentine history. Basically, we had a monetary imbalance worse than that before the Rodrigazo. We had a bankruptcy situation in the central bank, even worse than that before 1989, the hyperinflation of Alfonsín, which, in wholesalers, ended up hovering around an inflation rate of 5,000% per year. Sometimes you have to mention these things to remember. Some lived through them, others told them about them. And, on the other hand, we had social indicators worse than those of 2001. That is to say, we were facing what was going to be the worst crisis in all of Argentine history, and basically we did not complain about it, because we knew that the possibility of a libertarian liberal becoming president was not going to happen under normal conditions of pressure and temperature. So we were prepared for a situation in which the previous government exploded, or if the previous government was successful and left the bomb to us. In that sense, we had different programs planned. And so, from day one, we got to work. To give you a rough idea of magnitude, we received twin deficits for 17 points of GDP. And with that one would say, how serious is it or not? Look, when you have 4 of twin deficits, in terms of GDP, it is a yellow alert. 8 means that you are going to hit each other. Imagine what 17 is. That was the size of the monster that was coming. Just as José Luis points out, the price indexes, in the first week of December, were running at a rate of 3,700% annually, or 1% daily. In the second week they accelerated to 7,500%. And if you and we present that there was a scenario of possibility that the planned inflation was 15,000%, and, indeed, the wholesale inflation, in December, which is the one anticipated for retailers, was 54% monthly, that annualized is 17,000%. And if you look, in the month of April, the wholesale inflation was 3.4%, that is, annualized 50%. I understand that 50% annually is a lot and obviously it pisses me off to have that level of inflation, but let's agree that we come from 17,000%. And achieving a reduction from 17,000 to 50%. In 4 months, there are no historical records of having done something like that. Because at the same time, we achieved that without there being a previous explosion, as in other cases. We achieved it without there being expropriations, called, for example, a Bonex plan. We did it without price controls or agreements, and at the same time, we did not set the exchange rate, which is a mechanism to accelerate the decline in inflation. Therefore, in terms of achievement, the achievement is enormous. Regardless of whether certain political actors want to recognize it or not. On the other hand, how did we do it? Basically, we faced those 17 points of twin deficit, where 15 were from the Treasury, where 5 were in the Treasury and 10 were in the central bank. In that sense, our economic program, like every economic program, has a fiscal leg, a monetary leg, and an external sector leg. As far as the fiscal leg is concerned, we went to a zero deficit program. I remember that many who criticize, now, about the composition of the adjustment and so on, said that adjusting more than 1 point of GDP was impossible. In the first stage, we were actually thinking of going to zero deficit throughout the year 2024. And yet, Minister Caputo, with incredible courage, managed to get the accounts back on track, and already, in the month of January, we were in financial equilibrium. That is, not only in primary equilibrium, that is, the operational one, but also paying the interests. And that has been repeated during all the months. May will also be in surplus again, and although seasonally, due to the payment of bonuses, the month of June is in deficit. When you take the 6 months together, we are in surplus, that is, the zero deficit is still standing, even though they want to show that. As if without considering the seasonality of the month of June, that is, which is reasonable. But in order to smear the situation, they are capable of saying that even the zero deficit has been broken, when, in reality, the zero deficit is still standing. Because you have to take into account how it is accumulating, and in that sense we are going to end up with surplus accounts, also, in the consolidated 6 months. And that adjustment, which was made in the first stage, when the brake was applied, was equivalent to the equivalent, if you annualize it, of 7% of the annualized GDP. Now we are on the way to the levels we needed. I remember that they told us, oh, but it has a lot of blender and cuts, it has scissors. So those who said that it was impossible to achieve fiscal balance now started saying that the issue was the blender and the scissors. Look, the truth is that 90% of the adjustment is a chainsaw. We cut the number of ministries by half, we eliminated public works. We practically eliminated discretionary transfers to provinces, and we faced a program of rationalization of social spending like never before, where, historically, we have demanded to eliminate the managers of poverty, eliminate the intermediaries, and boy are we doing it. And boy are we finding a lot of corrupt people, and we are filling them with cases in court. Therefore, we are not only fulfilling the mandate of the polls to lower inflation, we are not only fulfilling the mandate to put the streets in order, a great merit of Minister Bullrich, but we are also waging a relentless fight against the corrupt and those who sank this country, who use noble causes to hide behind the poor. And when you are touching their work, you accuse them of being insensitive, when in reality what is happening is that they are crying and screaming basically because their work is running out and because they have a cash shortage. The other titanic part was the work of the central bank, having to face a quasi-fiscal deficit by 10 points of GDP. There were several things done in terms of monetary policy. On the one hand, we had negative net international reserves of $11.5 billion, almost $12 billion. In addition, we had a 200% exchange rate gap. There was a ratio of 3 to 1. I remember when, after the PASO elections, I went to live at the Libertador Hotel, because as I was living in Benavides, that meant at least an hour of travel during non-peak hours. And during rush hour it could take 2 or 3. So, due to a question of dynamics, I needed to stay in Capital Federal. And I remember when we were at the Libertador Hotel with Toto Caputo, with Santiago Basili, and part of that wonderful team that they have put together. And it had to be said, strictly speaking, that we could not get out of the trap. Because basically we had the problem of the Sierra debt, which was equivalent to $50,000 million. We had the problem of trapped dividends. We had the problem of remunerated liabilities. So you can see the level of perversion of what the previous government left. They moved all remunerated liabilities to one day. This means that if we had happily done it as they expected us to do, without being aware of all this, we would have quintupled the monetary base in one day. So, the hyperinflation was evident. They were going to start with their traditional policy of looting and attacking supermarkets and all those things that today some journalists are promoting, which constitutes a crime. In that sense, they had planned to overthrow the government by December, so that by January they would be there. And we would pay for all the cost of the adjustment and make all the inflationary disaster and finish killing, once and for all, liberalism in Argentina. In that sense, we knew that we could not leave because we also had the equivalent of debt maturities in pesos. For $90 billion, we had debt maturities in foreign currency for $25,000 million. Mostly with multilateral organizations, but we had fallen through with the agreement with the fund due to the fiscal disaster. To give you an idea of the disaster that these people created, over the course of 4 years, they issued money for 28 points of GDP, which is the real scam of seigniorage, which later translates into the inflationary tax, which was mentioned, very correctly, earlier by Professor Espert. In addition, they issued 28 points of GDP, that is, they stole 28 points of GDP. Because the monetary issue is a scam. But of those 28, they issued 13 points of GDP during the last year. What they did is a scandal, it is a scandal. And then I remember that, at that time, the economists said that the exchange rate had to be brought to $600, and they had an inflation scenario, the consensus, and everyone repeated the consensus quite a bit. It is interesting because when we were there, I told them, let's set the exchange rate at a level that is similar to that of the market. Now, I am going to explain why. But then, since we were considering the country tax, then that meant that it had to be set at around $800, and we were heavily criticized. That is why now, those same people who criticized us, now those same people who are criticizing us and talk about the exchange rate lag, they had made the scenario with a $600 exchange rate and more inflation, and we put it at $800 and with much less inflation. That's why I say, the serial blunderers, which are some economists who consult so much, are quite funny. That allowed, for example, that we bought, since the beginning of the administration, $17.5 billion. I love it when they come and criticize it. Those who, in the middle, looted the central bank for $45 billion. At the same time, what has to do with the remunerated liabilities that generated 10 points of fiscal deficit? In terms of GDP, we have lowered that deficit to 1 point of GDP. That is, between the 7, which are now 6, that we made in the Treasury, and the 9, that we made in the central bank. The adjustment is 15 points of GDP. That is, and we are returning 15 points of GDP to the private sector. Where do you see that? While in December we were discussing the hyperinflation that was coming, today we are discussing mortgage loans for 30 years. If you don't believe that, in 4 months, that's not a lot. I don't know what these people understand about the times in the economy. And another thing that was very interesting was how, then, because I just gave you the result of how much we reduced the quasi-fiscal, but it is also very interesting how that was lowered, because what we did was arbitrate the rate in dollars. Taking into account that the Argentines, as a consequence of having been scammed, from 1935 onwards, with the local currency, 10 to 1 to buy dollars, that is, that the economy is very immune. It is not because the Argentines are bad, it is because we have had a policy, which is a fucking piece of shit. And in that sense, we arbitrate the rate in dollars, and that implied a negative interest rate in pesos, but in dollars it was enormous. And we were also criticized a lot for that. If we had listened to those who said that the interest rate had to be positive, by I don't know how much, in real terms, today we would have a relationship of remunerated liabilities of 8 to 1. We would be talking about the carry trade and when hyperinflation breaks out. And today, and this is very important for me, so that you keep it in mind, the relationship of remunerated liabilities to monetary bases is 1.2 times, that is, we have them against the ropes. But now I am going to tell you even nicer things, which is why we are very calm. Despite what is happening in the exchange market, where some are taking advantage to make their apocalyptic predictions. And I am talking about serial blunderers. Argentina has a monetary base of 15 billion pesos and remunerated liabilities are 18 billion pesos. Now the interesting thing is that of those 18 billion pesos, 12 billion pesos are in the public sector, in public banks. Of those 12 billion pesos, 7 billion are in the Banco Nación Argentina, where the national state also has 3.5 billion. Another important part is in the Banco Provincia, with the fiscal situation of the province of Buenos Aires and the way the Banco Provincia is used, the liquidity situation is very tight. So they will not be able to touch that. What does that mean? That the problem of remunerated liabilities was reduced to 6 billion pesos. When we have already made placements for 11 or 12 billion pesos, and the market had tried to bid for close to 20 billion pesos. What does that mean? That we have the remunerated liabilities on the ropes. Why is it important that we have the remunerated liabilities on the ropes? Because while we have the remunerated liabilities on the ropes, which we will soon eliminate, not having a fiscal deficit, with which there is no need to issue to finance the treasury. The day we fix a problem that the previous government left us, called puts, which is basically a mechanism by which the fiscal deficit was financed by turning a blind eye to the International Monetary Fund, and the banks did not want to finance the treasury. So, they put it inside the central bank. The day we finish fixing that, we are in a position to lift the restrictions, and we are in negotiations with the financial institutions to end the problem. Basically, of the puts. And the day we finish the problem of the puts, the restrictions will end. And also, since we are not going to control prices, the exchange rate will be free. But what is interesting, given that we are not going to issue pesos, neither to issue for the treasury, nor to buy dollars, nor to support the financial system, the amount of money will be fixed. And when we can determine the fixed amount of money, since we believe that issuing money is a crime, we will send a non-issuance law. This law of non-issuance will mean that when there is monetary issuance, the President of the nation, the Minister of Economy, the President of the Central Bank and all of its board, and the deputies and senators, who defraud people with the issuance of monetary, will go to jail. Now it is true that there are some who can say, well, but here there were laws and they were taken away. Yes, it is true. Now it is also true that we are going to give this law the category of a crime against humanity. Therefore, it is imprescriptible. So, another government will be able to come and, suddenly, issue again and go back to the old ways. And surely they will want to change the law when they want to do that, and they will give a lot of very sentimental reasons, as they always do. But always when inflation returns, people will remember that we liberals are the ones who exterminated inflation, and then, when another government returns, they will remind them that that was an imprescriptible crime. And they will put them all in jail. So we are going to move forward with that, because we are going to definitively, forever, end inflation in Argentina. On the other hand, another thing that we knew was going to happen is that, clearly, at the time of making a stabilization program that generates an increase in savings and given the conditions that Argentina generates, there was not going to be an investment counterpart. Therefore, we knew that there was going to be a fall in economic activity. The fact of having set the exchange rate very similar to that of the market, what it did was narrow the gap, and by reducing the excess demand for foreign currency, it reduced the excess supply in the bond market, thus lowering the interest rate. In fact, we received a country risk of 2,900, we got to be at 1,100, and today, thanks to the policy, which only wants to do is break it, because they know that, if this works, the thieves will not return. So, now the country risk is at 1,500, but now, believe me, we are going to defeat it too. Apart from that, one of the things we did was double the AUH. In fact, the AUH is at its highest level since it began to be granted. If we add the food card, there has never been so much assistance to the vulnerable sector of the economy. In addition, we gave assistance to the middle class through the delivery of school supplies and through financing of school fees. And although we fell in the first quarter, we fell much less than we should have fallen in conditions of the adjustment we are making. And the most interesting thing, and that is what has politicians so nervous, is because it is not only that inflation is falling, economic activity has begun to rebound. When you start to look at the economic indicators, it is true that, compared to the previous year, they are falling, but when you look at the seasonally adjusted month by month, the vast majority of indicators are rising very strongly. You want an example? For example, credit. Credit is growing 650% compared to the previous year, and it is growing 45% compared to last month. That is, the economy is rebounding and will rebound strongly. So, if today, despite having made the largest adjustment in the history of humanity, my image is still at the levels of when we took office, when the voting intention of the space is around 55%, that is, with which, if we were to have a general election, we would win in the first round by a landslide. You know that the thieves are nervous. The caste is afraid and is so afraid that the only thing it does is want to sabotage this government. One of the clear signs. Yes, that's me. Why is that? It's not you, but wait a bit. I'm finishing the conference. So, look at this, what the degenerate prosecutors do, who are in Congress. They are constantly sending laws to try to sabotage the backbone of the economic program, which is the fiscal surplus. They gave an example of this yesterday. But in addition, they could not stop showing that they are a filthy caste because they raised the diets by 80%. That is to say, to pass the structural reforms which we good Argentines need, they have taken 6 months, but to approve the increase for themselves, they do it quickly. How efficient are they when they want to with theirs? And as if all this were not enough, the issue of eliminating the privileged pensions was blocked. So I don't give a damn, because I am going to give up my privileged pension because you know what, if I do my job well, then I will be able to continue working in the private sector when I leave this position. But of course, these people are used to making a mess for the last 100 years, so they have an insurance, which are the privileged pensions. No, enough, if you did things wrong, you deserve to starve, you son of a bitch, and that is why they must be eliminated. As for the opposition and the Central Korea's will to overturn the government's economic program, the reality is that if they go against fiscal balance, we will veto everything that goes against fiscal balance. I will not give up zero deficit in any way, and if they still look for a mechanism to continue breaking fiscal balance, I will lower public spending even more until it hurts politics more. So have no doubt that zero deficit is here to stay. Finally, in terms of the macro, the exchange rate has jumped. Now, the reality is that we maintain that inflation is always, everywhere, a monetary phenomenon that is generated by an excessive money supply, either because supply rises or because demand falls. And that causes the purchasing power of the peso to fall and all prices, expressed in monetary units, to rise. The dollar is just another price in the economy, so why is the dollar rising? So, one says, well, the reality is that there is room for demand to fall, since January. Look, the truth is that there is no room. Because when you take the monetary base, during the 21st century, on average it was 9 to 10% of GDP, and today the monetary base is 2.8% of GDP. There is not much room for the demand for money to fall. Moreover, you say, well, but there are the paid ones and you could. Let's suppose that we take the total of the paid ones, which we already know would not be correct. Even if we took the total of the paid ones, we are at 6% of GDP. Therefore, it has nothing to do with a demand problem, so the question is, does it have to do with a supply problem? No, if we are not issuing to finance the treasury. So, why does this happen? Basically, it happens because of the degenerate prosecutors who are in Congress. What happens when the fiscal degenerates are trying to torpedo the fiscal surplus? What happens is that the perception is that, if they succeed, the solvency condition of the state falls. The government falls, and therefore, the price of bonds falls. And why is this important? And that is what you see today with a country risk of 1500. Why is this important? Because you, today, as there is capital control, do not buy dollars directly, you do it indirectly. And in that sense, the indirect mechanism to do so is the bonds. So, what you are seeing today in the price of bonds is the problem of the fiscal degenerates trying to break the fiscal balance, and it is not due to a monetary problem. When you see the numbers for May, when you see the numbers for June, and you see that the fiscal result is granite and we are not going to deliver the fiscal result, automatically, the numbers for the bonds will adjust, and automatically the exchange rate will adjust. That is why we are not nervous about what is happening with the exchange rate. And it is quite funny to all the apocalyptic, serial screw-ups, who want things to go wrong so they can validate the lousy models they always screwed up with. So, the question is, okay, do we have the macro in order, or are we putting it in order? So, the question is, how are we going to grow? The first thing is, first, we are rebounding, and that will manifest itself in an improvement in activity and employment. In fact, real wages, for 2 months, have been rising, and if you look at it, in terms of food, they have been rising much more. So the number of indigent poor will have to start going down when the new measures are taken, but apart from that, not those that are still left over and that have the impact of the first semester. So, we are seeing the rebound, in fact, it is being seen. Another element that will boost economic growth is that increasing savings by 15 points of GDP will translate into investment. At the same time, an economy that has been plagued by populism for 20 years and has destroyed capital, in abundance, means that the real returns on the economy are very high. Therefore, the economy has a lot of room to grow just because of the destruction of capital that occurred. So, that is what will explain how the economy will start to rebound and grow in the short term. And on the other hand, even though it seems that there are setbacks, the ley basis has a chance of being passed and the DNU is working. So, more or less, so that you have an order of magnitude. The largest structural reform that was made in Argentina was made by Menem in the 90s. If you take the DNU and the ley base as it is today, this reform is 8 times larger than the one that was made. It is the largest reform in Argentine history. And then they say that we don't have an economic program, which seems like a load of rubbish to me, and I'm going to put it quantitatively. These reforms imply that we are going to rise, in economic freedom, 90 places. That is, we would stop being a country that was on its way to becoming Venezuela. And we are on our way to becoming a country similar to Germany, or France, or Italy. But I want to tell you more. Our objective is to be the country with the greatest economic freedom in the world. For example, something like what Ireland did at the time, which being the most miserable country in Europe, today has a GDP per capita 50% higher than that of the United States. Or things like those of Switzerland, or like those of Luxembourg. But since we have pending, after this 3,200 more structural reforms, we are going to become the freest country on the planet. And that will make us, in a period of 30 or 40 years, become the most prosperous country in the world, and that is the plan. And finally, the most interesting thing is what we are going to do when the economy starts to grow, because that is when a lot of fiscal resources will appear. Obviously, what do the fiscal degenerates want to do? Spend it themselves, but our idea is that when the fiscal surplus begins to be produced in a sustained manner, we will give it back to the good people, to those who work. To those who are truly the great heroes of Argentina, we will give it back to them with tax cuts. And obviously, as Professor Espert said, in our sites we have the country tax. We have the withholdings and we have the tax on bank debits and credits, which are super distorting. And, if you want, the greatest testimony that I want to lower them, effectively, and that I will lower them, when the economy starts to recover, do you know what it is? I never wanted to participate, because if I had participated, we would not be able to get them anymore. So, the best testimony I have to give you, and the best proof that, effectively, when the economy starts to grow and the fiscal surplus starts to be large, we are going to be lowering taxes, basically. Why? Because I never wanted to participate in them. So that is going to give a new push to economic growth and, without a doubt, if we continue to embrace the ideas of liberty, in 35 years we are going to be one of the great world powers. Thank you very much.